Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Eve Samples, Executive Director at Friends of the Everglades. Welcome to our April Clean Water Conversation. We bring you these live stream events every month as a way to help keep you informed about what's going on in terms of water policy in Florida. There's an awful lot to keep track of, not just environmentally in Florida, but also in terms of other legislation coming out of Tallahassee. So our goal today is to help you understand what's going on with one of the most important pieces of environmental legislation that emerged from Tallahassee this year. It was Senate Bill 2508. Maybe you've heard those numbers, maybe you know a little bit about it. We're going to help you understand what it means, why it's environmentally damaging legislation, why Friends of the Everglades and other allies have called for Governor DeSantis to veto it, and where we can go from here. So that's a lot to tackle. We thank you all for joining us. If you're live on Facebook or on YouTube, you can post comments or questions in the chat. We'll get to as many of those as possible at the end. So without further ado, I want to introduce our guest today. First, we have Matt DePaulis. Matt joined Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation as policy director earlier this year. He's tasked with interpreting science and translating it into viable environmental policy, especially in Southwest Florida. He spent the beginning of his career working as a field biologist and in tropical and subtropical environments, and spent the last several years working on environmental policy issues in areas as diverse as Oregon and Florida. So welcome, Matt. We're honored to have you here today.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Thanks. Next, we have Dave Preston. Dave is an avid fly fisherman, born and raised in Miami, as I was too. Serves on the board of directors of Friends of the Everglades. We're honored to have him. And I just will note that he's spent a lot of time exploring the waters of Florida Bay, the Everglades, Biscayne Bay. And when he's not fishing, he is working as a commercial real estate broker. Dave's a wealth of knowledge. We're happy to have you here today. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you so much, Eve. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. Last but not least, we have Gil Smart, our own policy director at Friends of the Everglades. Gil wears two hats. He also serves as executive director of Vote Water, our sister organization. Prior to his time with Vote Water and Friends of the Everglades, Gil was a journalist for 30 years. Gil, always a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Well, we're going to spend the next 40 minutes or so talking about Senate Bill 2508, and then we'll dive into some questions as the audience has them. So I'm just going to start with a really high-level 30,000-foot overview of what happened with this legislation. Then we're going to dive into some of the details. So on Friday, February 4th, I got word that a bill had been filed, which we came to know as Senate Bill 2508, and that it was filed as a budget conforming bill. So this was attached to the state's massive budget and included a litany of environmental policy measures, many of which concerned us. So I actually got word of this via a media contact who reached out to me and asked what it meant. So we sprung into action at Friends of the Everglades to try to understand the implications. And we quickly learned that there were very alarming provisions in terms of Everglades policy, water management, including water moving from Lake Okeechobee, a new land buying program that would be under the Department of Agriculture instead of giving the primary allotment of money to Florida's very popular Florida Forever program. And it also had a really weird provision in it related to allowing public utilities like FPL to pay to expedite permits. So in a nutshell, that's what was in it then. And we were opposed to it. So Gil actually hopped in his car and drove up to Tallahassee. Dave, I know you traveled to Tallahassee on this too. We're going to talk about it. And the bill over time was watered down a bit, but the most damaging provisions still remain. It ended up passing the House and Senate overwhelmingly. And here we are today. The bill has not yet been transmitted to Governor DeSantis's desk. And many organizations, including ours, are calling for a veto. About 2,500 supporters of Friends of the Everglades have sent Governor DeSantis a message asking him to veto this bad bill. So that's kind of where we sit today. And I'm going to ask Gil that you give us kind of a little bit more detail in terms of your trip to Tallahassee, how that played out, and what remains the most problematic in this bill.
Sure. Well, we had to scramble it, as you said, because the bill was filed on a Friday. The following Wednesday was going to be the sole legislative hearing. It was in front of the Senate Appropriations Committee. I was there, dozens and dozens of other people were there, dozens of guys who drove literally like hours, 6 and 8 hours just to get there, just to have their say, mobilized by other groups around Florida. Captains for Clean Water, got a whole bunch of people there. But what was interesting about the dynamic at the hearing was the extent to which the legislators seemed contemptuous of these people who made this concerted effort to, leave, thousands of dollars on the table for a lot of these fishing guys who had trips booked, who just dropped everything to come up to the state capitol to say, no, this is a bad bill, and the way the legislators treated them was actually offensive. I've never seen public servants treat the public that way, frankly. They insinuated that some of the people who were there to object didn't know what they're talking about, hadn't read the bill, or hadn't read it correctly, or hadn't read all the cross references in the bill. The committee chair, Kelly Stargell, wound up ultimately giving people 45 seconds to speak. Imagine driving 8 hours to, weigh in, as is your right, on a bill that's going to have a significant impact on your business. And you get 45 seconds rather to speak. It went on and on like this. It was actually offensive. I was a journalist for 30 years, as noted. This was one of the most offensive things I've ever seen, come out of a public body like the Florida Senate. But ultimately, as you noted, they did water it down before passing it. But some of the provisions that we were most concerned about are still in there. And even though the wording isn't as maybe sharp or as objectionable as the initial format, one of the big things that we have been concerned about is the fact that this legislation still would make into state law water shortage management rules, which favor big sugar, favor big agriculture. The way that the state water shortage rules are written, and you can get very sort of into the weeds on this, 40E 21 and 40E 22. But basically what happens is once water managers, in this case, the South Florida Water Management District, declares a water shortage emergency, all of a sudden, all these different agriculture, car washes, all these different water users face some restrictions. Okay. But there's no restrictions until and unless a water shortage is declared. Now, environmental deliveries of water, which includes water that goes to Everglades National Park and includes water that goes west of the Tallahassee, is not articulated as a water user in these rules, which means because they're not covered, it doesn't matter. You can cut off deliveries to the Everglades. You can cut off water, needed discharges to the Tallahassee whenever you want, because it's not covered in this. Okay. So that is what the backers of this bill wanted to make sure was law, became state law. And they did it. The legislation, the way it reads now, it provides a means by which that could change. It says that, any change to these rules may not take effect until ratified by the legislator and presented to the governor. Basically says, you can change these rules. And changing those rules, we think, makes sense now because the LOSUM process has been going on for several years. If you're going to rethink the way you manage water shortages and who gets what, now is really the time to do that, which is likely another reason that we saw this bill filed when it was and the way it was filed. But this bill, if it gets signed by Governor DeSantis and becomes law, will allow for change, but you have to wonder how much appetite for change exists in the state legislature. We haven't seen any sort of attempt to change this up until now. Why would things suddenly change that? So that was one of the most problematic aspects of this bill. Like I said, the wording's different now than it was originally, but that remains in the bill.
Thanks, Gil. And for the purposes of this discussion, I do think we're going to zoom in on those water shortage rules and how Senate Bill 2508 added a legislative hurdle to updating those outdated status quo rules that have led to toxic algae blooms on both coasts. So Just to oversimplify, Senate Bill 2508 preserves status quo rules that have led to toxic algae blooms on both coasts. So,
And that are likely to lead to additional toxic algae blooms in the future.
exactly. They need updating, and we're going to talk about that more today. So, Matt, I want to turn now to you. Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation, Friends of the Everglades, the Conservancy of Southwest Florida, and Calusa Waterkeeper joined together about a month ago to send a letter directly to Governor DeSantis requesting that he veto this legislation. Why is Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation so concerned about this bill?
Yeah, Sanibel is a barrier island community, as many people are aware, and basically everything that we do revolves around our water and the health of our water. This goes for the whole natural ethos here on the island that we have, that we're dedicated to protecting nature, but it also directly, our economy directly responds to how that water quality, how the water quality is functioning. Everyone's fairly aware of the large red tide event we had in 2018 with huge marine life die-offs, hundreds of thousands of pounds of marine life washing up on the beaches. And that was hugely negative to obviously the marine life, but as well the economy, where we lost billions of dollars throughout this area. So everyone on the islands of Sanibel and Captiva now understands how important water quality is moving forward, and that our ecology is our economy. So regardless of where you fall on a political spectrum or what your interests are, clean water is at the heart of everything when you're living on a barrier island like this. And 2508, we think, really just gets in the way of having clean water. As Gil mentioned, there are important flows that need to come down the Caloosahatchee in order for us to protect our estuaries. And there is a pocket of flow that needs to be maintained. We can't handle too much water when there's toxic algal blooms happening in Lake Okeechobee, or we'll have red tide die-offs, but we can't have too little water either. Or the salinity of our estuary will get too high and we'll see tape grass die-offs, we'll see oyster die-offs, and that'll have a hugely negative impact on the finfish in the area as well. So historically, the Caloosahatchee was never connected to Lake O, but starting in the mid 1800s and through everything that's been done in the Everglades, it's now an integrated watershed, and it needs to be managed with that understanding that we need some water and we need enough to have healthy ecosystems, healthy Caloosahatchee watershed. And that'll lead to the healthy estuaries that surround our island. So 2508, we're worried that it's going to have a chilling effect, as Gil mentioned, that with the legislature getting involved, we're fearful that policy will get in the way, or politics will get in the way of science. We've done a ton of work on the LOSUM process in order to utilize the best science to bring about the best solutions for everyone involved. We understand that we need water, the Everglades needs water, Ag needs water, St. Lucie to an extent can handle some, but we think that the science that we put forward in the LOSUM process is strong and we can stand on it. And it's the science to solutions mindset that we need to be working forward. And the more politics gets involved and the more people aren't free to do their job or are afraid of repercussions from doing their job, then the less likely we are to utilize good science. And we think 2508 directly stands in the way of that. In addition, with the expedited permitting process, we're worried about more development in the riparian areas on the watershed is going to introduce new nutrients to the water that aren't necessarily as controllable as those nutrient outputs from Lake O. And so we would like any development to be thoroughly vetted following the appropriate processes, and being able to pay for a development permit isn't something that we support in any way. And then in addition to that, we're supporters of the Florida Forever land acquisitions. And we think that putting FDACs in charge of some of those land acquisitions, while not inherently problematic on its face, could possibly lead to land being prioritized for agriculture or water quality at the cost of the environment, or even leased back to agriculture after that land is purchased. So there's a myriad of issues that could arise from that. And we think the DEP is in a better space to monitor those land acquisitions. So everything in this bill really just slows down our approach to getting clean water.
That's really well explained, Matt. Thank you. After the bill was watered down, amended to remove some of the rough edges, I heard some people who were paying kind of casual attention say, oh, well, there are some good things in this bill. And really, if you study it and you look at the policy, it's absolutely untrue. There's nothing good for the environment in this bill. Perhaps if you stand to make money from land acquisition, if you're an agricultural landowner, you might think it's good. But from an environmental perspective, there's nothing good in this bill. So thanks for highlighting that. And it's kind of shocking that the legislature would prioritize this. This was a high priority of not just Senator Ben Albritton, who sponsored it, but also Senate President Wilton Simpson. High enough priority that it was expedited with one hearing. And this came right on the heels of a record manatee die-off related to poor water quality, as we've experienced on the East Coast in the Indian River Lagoon. So we really feel a kindred spirit with our allies in Southwest Florida because of the devastation you described, Matt. And this kind of water policy is exactly what we don't need to improve the situation. So with that said, I'm going to turn to you, Dave. You're an angler, you're on the water all the time. And you took time out of your busy work schedule to head up to Tallahassee because you were so upset about this bill. What's your take on it? Why did it prompt you to make that long drive?
Well, it had been 6 years since I've been up there. I went up there for the Senate Bill 10 hearings 4 or 5 times back in, I think it was 2016, right?
17, I think.
17. So yeah, a lot of it was deja vu when we got up there. The legislature definitely was not happy to see us. The turnout was really impressive for I believe it was a Thursday that we showed up, and they heard we were coming. They heard we were coming in numbers. The collective groups, between us and Captains for Clean Water and a few of the other groups did a really good job of kind of sounding the alarm on this bill quickly and meaningfully, to the point that I think 150 or 200 of us ended up there on that Thursday. And it wasn't just individuals, and it wasn't just people who cared about this personally, but like you said, Eve, it was fishing guides who should have been on the water, feeding their families and working. It was also a good showing of companies and corporations that depend on the water, for their success and prosperity. Like Costa del Mar had representatives there. Patagonia, Hell's Bay was there. And I guess that was something that was maybe a little bit different than what we saw in 2017. Because the business community has really rallied around these water issues now. And I think what the legislature is really missing now, after 3 relatively dry years where we have not had Lake Okeechobee discharges, and by the way, we probably would have had them one of those years if not for a strong effort by the groups and some individual politicians who lobbied hard to keep those gates closed. It seems like we're kind of going back to the old attitude in Tallahassee. Hey, look, everything's fine. There's no problem to see here. That's not true. I'm pretty sure if you went and polled most Floridians, the results would show that your average Floridian sees our water issues as a huge issue, and something that needs to be fixed. And the status quo is not acceptable. Kind of to your point in how we labeled this meeting today. Basically, Eve, like you kind of outlined, there's nothing good that I can find in this bill. This is not a water bill. It's really an anti-water bill. And by the way, when you hear water supply users, usually that means you're hearing from Florida Crystals and U.S. Sugar. They do have a lot of allies around this state, and there certainly are other categories of water users, but they all kind of rally around those two companies who farm sugarcane on 700 square miles of field south of the lake. And those two companies have primarily been responsible for blocking pretty much every effort to change the status quo meaningfully over the last several decades. So make no mistake, they're right in the middle of this bill, and this bill is about them making sure that this perfectly engineered system that they've built for themselves, where they get every drop of water they need in dry conditions and perfect irrigation in wet conditions that lead to record crop yield every year. They want to make sure nothing changes. So that, my biggest concern, like you guys sort of outlined, there's three alarming components to this bill in its current form. Obviously, there was a lot more bad stuff in the original bill. Some of those things were peeled off actually at about 10 o'clock at night. The evening before we arrived on that Thursday morning, the bill was scaled back pretty dramatically, which is good. But of those three provisions, the most alarming is really the provision that ties the hands of the South Florida Water Management District. When the governor was voted into office, whether you love the guy or you don't like the guy now, I think everybody could agree that it was incredibly meaningful what he did. One of his first major moves, he cleared out the South Florida Water Management District governing board pretty much on day one, and installed a governing board that was widely considered to be a lot more solutions based. Let's put it that way. And basically, he gave that board a mandate to do everything in their power under his orders to try to fix these water issues that we're talking about, or as many as possible, as quickly as possible. So why is the legislature trying to tie their hands now? I think the answer to that question is pretty obvious. And just to get into a little more detail on how they would tie their hands, right now, the district has administrative rules that dictate how water is managed during a drought, right? That's when we're in a water shortage, and that's when the Everglades needs every drop of water the most, right? That's also when U.S. Sugar and Florida Crystals need every drop of water the most, or want every drop of water. I guess whether they want it or need it, it's pretty important to differentiate, right? But the Everglades needs it or it dies. Let's go back to 2014 when Florida Bay did not get the water it needed, and the water supply to Florida Bay from the north dropped below the water shortage band twice during that dry season. It resulted in hypersalinity in Florida Bay. We had water so salty in parts of the bay, it was 3 times as salty as ocean water. That ended up in a massive seagrass die-off. We lost over 50,000 acres of seagrass. That dead seagrass floated to the surface, and then it broke apart and basically disintegrated, and the sediment drifted back down to the bottom, creating like a muck layer of nutrients. It clogged up the sloughs around the islands. It created large just mud flats for miles, where you used to have lush seagrass, turtle grass, shoal grass, which was home to forage food for every game fish you could possibly imagine. That grass was home to shrimp and crabs and bait fish, and it was just an incredibly rich estuary, just with amazing biodiversity, where you had snook, redfish, tarpon, bonefish, just pretty much just lived in these areas and didn't really leave. And now, 8 years later, things have gotten back a little more to normal conditions in the bay, but there's still large areas that have not recovered, where you still have a lot of mud, you have patches of grass. When there's wind, the wind kicks up that muck and sediment, and it just turns Florida Bay into a giant mud bowl. and then you have a sunny day where the sunlight shines through those nutrients and creates these giant algae blooms, which kind of compounds some of these issues that are lingering from that 14 die-off. So anyways, we can't afford to go through 2014 conditions again. And we can't afford to drop below that red line, that water supply line again. And what the legislature is doing is basically locking in the district rules that caused that shortage to begin with. We're supposed to be trying to fix these rules, not lock them in.
Yeah.
And Gil, to your point, yes, what they were trying to do was take these rules away from the district and make them state law. And that was changed a little bit. And I would say maybe it's a little better, but what they did is they made it state law that the district can't change the rules. I mean, is that really that different?
Right.
I would say no, it's almost exactly the same. The end result is these rules are not going to change under either scenario. So those are my biggest concerns as a fisherman who spends a lot of time in the Everglades in Florida Bay.
Thanks, Dave. That's really helpful. So the status quo rules that we're talking about boil down to what I've heard coined as hold and dump strategy. You're holding back water in the lake in case the 500,000 acres of sugarcane south of the lake need it during the dry season. And if they don't need it, you're dumping it east and west, which is harmful. And the hold part is harmful to the southern Everglades and Florida Bay. So it's problematic for all three estuaries. It benefits powerful sugarcane companies, U.S. Sugar and Florida Crystals, let's say the names, and the rest of us suffer. So we did look poised to change that in recent years after the 2018 devastation Matt described, but this bill takes us backwards. So where are we now? It hasn't been officially transmitted to Governor DeSantis's desk. That will happen in the coming weeks. He has until June 30th to either veto it, which is certainly our hope, sign it, or the third option is he could let it become law on July 1st without his signature. And let's not pretend that that's an acceptable solution. So Gil, about 2,500 Friends of the Everglades supporters have sent veto messages to the governor. If DeSantis signs this, what do you think it will say about his environmental credibility?
Well, I think it amounts to a massive gift to the sugar industry, frankly. This, from a governor who, when he initially ran for governor, was willing to criticize the sugar industry. He talked about how, subsidies ought to go away. He'd made a point of saying he wasn't going to take money from the sugar industry, and I think that sort of aroused a lot of sort of hope amongst those who follow these issues, thinking that maybe this time is going to be different. If he signs this legislation, this time isn't different. It's just, like I said, it's yet another gift to the sugar industry. Dave is right. I mean, the industry, is sort of the hidden hand behind this legislation. During the testimony at that sole public hearing, Eric Eichenberg, CEO of the Everglades Foundation, talked about how he was summoned. He used the word summoned by Senate President Wilton Simpson and by Big Sugar to hear what the industry wanted, out of LOSUM, what it wants out of the water managers. So, and at this point, I think everyone realizes that. I mean, that's been a major aspect of this story, the degree to which this legislation, watered down though it may have been. But I think Dave is right. I think ultimately it still delivers the goods for those who wanted this in the first place. And I think, that aspect of this, that's what we're saying in our veto request, essentially. There is nothing good in this bill. There is there's no rationale that Florida needs this bill. It's only going to be detrimental. Even the prospect of creating a new land acquisition program through the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services on the surface, as Matt says, might not seem like such a bad idea. But then you get to the reality that this may well end up competing with funding with Florida Forever. And as Matt suggested, there's the possibility that the land could be leased back to agriculture. So what's gained? What is gained by this bill? And politics is gained, I think. But at the end of the day, I don't think DeSantis can credibly claim to be, for the water of Florida if he's signing legislation that's ultimately going to be detrimental to the water of Florida.
Thanks, Gil. Matt, has Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation received much response to its veto request letter?
Yeah, so with the original bill, we sent out an alert to our members, and we had a huge response there. Over 13,000 emails were sent to the legislature. Unfortunately, that didn't have the desired effect, and the bill was passed. For the veto request, we've had over 750 emails sent directly to the governor's desk. So the response down here has been overwhelming on the island. People understand that this is going to be detrimental if it gets signed, and people are trying to do everything they can to stand in its way. The governor's office too has reached out to us to get our thoughts on the bill, and we told him that we have some huge issues with the three major parts of the bill, and hopefully something sinks in, and yeah, we see the response that we need. But we're all playing the waiting game at this point.
Yeah, exactly. It'll be interesting to see how long it takes to transmit to his desk and whether he takes action. So thanks for summarizing that. Dave, you and I were talking the other day about the high volume of controversial legislation coming out of Tallahassee this year and how easy it is for some of the culture wars, if you will, that kind of legislation to overshadow what's going on environmentally. So, how do you think we can keep the spotlight on this bill and these issues, even as the water looks better than it did in 2018? How do you think we can help people remember why this matters?
It's interesting. This is exactly, well, first of all, it's the cumulative effect, I would say, of bills like this over decades that are hard to understand, that are sort of that are kind of wonky, that basically have gotten us to where we are today, right? And I have the biggest change I've seen since I got involved in these issues back in like 2016 is now through the collective efforts of the different groups working on this issue. There's a lot better public understanding of these issues than ever before. People are paying attention. They're understanding sort of the nuts and bolts of these issues more so than ever, and they're understanding how important it is that we provide some accountability and we put a stop to this kind of thing. Right? It's what got us here. So that's huge. That's a sea level change, and I think Eve, you just we have to keep doing what we've been doing, right? I think the fact that 150 or 200 people showed up in Tallahassee on a Thursday morning with no notice, with boats and trailers and large companies, I mean that's amazing, and that would not have happened 5 or 10 years ago. And we just have to keep the spotlight on these issues. When a bill like this comes up, we have to jump all over it, and it's exhausting. I've heard it likened to a game of whack-a-mole, because when something like this bill pops up and you beat it back as best you can, pretty quickly just some other, whether it's a bill or a politician or whatever it is, pops up right over here on this side, and you have to go whack that one down, and it's an onslaught. But we just have to keep fighting, and we can't let them wear us out. And we have to keep the spotlight on these issues, and we have to continue to provide political accountability, because at the end of the day, this is a political issue, and it requires a political solution. So, I mean, we have to continue to make the politicians accountable. And look, I mean, we have, to a large extent, in the last governor's race, I think, what was it, 6 out of the 7 governor candidates pledged to not take money from the sugar industry. That's earth-shattering. I mean, that's amazing. Nothing like that's ever happened before, and we just have to continue those efforts, I think.
Yeah, I agree with all that, and I'd just add that I think it's tempting to prematurely proclaim victory when you get a watering down of a bill or a removal of some of the worst provisions. But I think it's really important to be honest about what we're getting in the end, and not to let them get away with it when they are continuing to push bad legislation through. We cannot cheer that on. And Floridians have been wakened. Where we sit and steward at Friends of the Everglades, that happened it happened decades ago, but in 2013, it was really visible when we had terrible toxic algae blooms here. Of course, in Southwest Florida, 2018 was the biggest year of reckoning, and the population just got involved and didn't let up, and it made a difference. So sticking with it and not pretending that problems or solutions is a big part of it. So Gil, we've talked a lot about how if this bill passes, it will make it more difficult to fix our water management problems. And that's the case as we're about to adopt a new Lake Okeechobee management plan. This is a once a decade plan that the Army Corps of Engineers has already spent 3 years developing. Friends of the Everglades and Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation, among others, have worked very hard to make this a more fair plan. These rules could hamstring that. So I want to kind of shift gears to talk about the prospect of more algae. A year ago at this time, there was a really terrible, ugly, toxic algae bloom at the Pahokee Marina in Lake Okeechobee. What do you think the outlook is this year for toxic algae in our waterways?
I think the outlook's probably, it's always looming. The prospect of this is always looming. And in fact, we've already seen toxic algae detected at Port Mayaca in Martin County. Our local news outlets reported this in early April. The Florida Department of DEP has issues its periodic blue-green algae bloom weekly update. The latest update says satellite imagery for Lake Okeechobee shows approximately 30% coverage of what they're calling low to moderate bloom potential. So 30% of the lake at this point, has a low to moderate bloom potential. And we're just in April now. The one thing that people keep saying to me is, it seems like the algae season is starting earlier. We're seeing it in April these days. It used to be maybe June. It used to be maybe a little bit later into the summer as the weather got a lot warmer. But, it makes sense, right? If the weather's getting warmer due to, climate change, and we've been seeing, higher temperatures here in March and April, then you're going to see algae forming sooner. So, but it all goes, the X factor is always going to be how much precipitation we get and how that's managed on Lake Okeechobee. Right now, this week, there was a periodic scientist call yesterday. The lake is at 13.08 feet. And it's been very dry these last couple of weeks. But the prognosis is for a wetter than normal summer. It's a La Nina year, and the La Nina is hanging around. They thought it was going to dissipate, maybe before hurricane season, but apparently that's not going to happen now. So the discussion with the Army Corps on the call yesterday was that we are going to see a wetter than usual spring and summer. And that's bad news. That is bad news for the lake, and that is bad news for the estuaries. If there happens to be algae on the lake and we get to the point where releases happen, batten down the hatches because all bets are off. It's coming our way then, So the prospect is always there. And I have to, Dave said this, and I think this is true. Right now, people look at the water and they say, what's the problem? And people have short memories, right? What happened a couple years ago tends to fade when the water looks good today. But the problem is, unless you fix the underlying problems, the water's going to look terrible again tomorrow. That's the reality. Unless we solve these problems, unless we stop bad legislation like this from passing and pass better legislation, the problems are always going to come back. It's just a question of when. And that's it. Will it happen this summer? Possibly, probably. But at some point it will happen, and it will be bad, and we'll be right back on square one.
Thanks, Gil. I'm going to remind our audience that if you have questions, please put them in the chat, either on YouTube or Facebook. We will be able to see those, and we'll address as many of those as we can get to in our final minutes. So, Matt, I want to turn it now to you and flip the narrative a little bit. Gil alluded to the need for positive legislation that would help the problem. Unfortunately, most years in Tallahassee, we get the opposite. We get legislation that harms the problem, makes it worse. So if you were a magician in Tallahassee, Matt, and could wave your magic wand, what kind of positive water improving legislation would you want to see passed?
I think there's a silver lining here in that from the federal level with the Clean Water Act all the way down to a lot of local municipal ordinances, there is a lot of really good water protecting legislation already on the books. And it really comes down to an enforcement problem that from the DEP standpoint, they're just not being able to enforce a lot of these laws that we have on the books. I think that they need to feel empowered to do their jobs, and the people who aren't doing their jobs need to be held accountable or given better tools to be able to more effectively protect our waterways. And I think Dave hit the nail on the head saying that every single session, it seems like there's more and more bills that pop up that try to get in the way of the enforcement actions taking place. They try to hamper the process. They add more bureaucracy to moves that should be easier to make by necessary parties. And they just bog the whole process down. And while all of this is going on, our water continues to be impacted, continues to get worse, and we have to deal with the ramifications. So I don't think we necessarily have to throw up our hands and say we need to go back to the drawing board and craft brand new legislation. But the tools that are already in place need to be better utilized to provide the protections that they were designed to.
Yeah, I just read a report recently on the 50-year anniversary of the Clean Water Act,
Yeah.
and how imperiled so many of our country's waterways are even after that landmark legislation. And Florida is among the worst in terms of mileage of impaired waterways, unfortunately. Nathaniel Reed, who lived here in Martin County for many years and helped write that legislation, and has since passed away. He once said that he wished the Clean Water Act would have clamped down more on agricultural pollution, non-point source pollution. And it didn't. And here we are today with a lack of rigorous enforcement, to your point, Matt, and severely impaired waterways in terms of nitrogen and phosphorus, which is what triggers these algae blooms that we're talking about. We've been discussing mainly water management today, how we move water, right? But of course, the input of these nutrients is what triggers algae blooms. And Florida has just done far too little to address that. We haven't even mentioned yet Senate Bill 1000 that was passed by the Florida legislature this year, which liberalizes fertilizer application on citrus groves. So even as we're grappling with toxic algae problems in Florida, the state legislature saw fit to pass a bill that allows for more fertilizer application, at least on citrus groves.
Eve, if I can just briefly
Yeah.
chime in, because one thing I did want to mention too is that we recently saw a story on our local news outlet here, TC Palm, talking about the Blue-Green Algae Task Force, which was formed by Governor DeSantis. Again, it was a hopeful moment, right? We're going to have this task force that's going to study these blue-green algae blooms and tell us what to do about it. Well, as the story reported, very, very few of the recommendations were adopted. We got the low-hanging fruit in the Clean Waterways Act of 2020, which basically called for additional study and better communication between, state agencies, that sort of thing. But the teeth of what they recommended has not been adopted, and for lack of political will, basically, because some of these things are difficult to do. You can't wave them. We all wish we had that magic wand. We can't wave that magic wand. It takes hard work. But if no one has a commit, and members of the task force in the article sort of publicly mused whether anyone in Tallahassee is listening to them. When you have that situation, you're going to have more algae blooms. You just are.
Yeah. I've got one more question for Dave, and then we're going to open it up for audience questions. I think we have a couple already. And if you have more questions, for those of you listening live, please pop them into the chat on YouTube or Facebook. So Dave, I think you said you've been involved in this fight since 2016. Do you think we are better off now than when you entered the fray?
That's a really tough one to answer, Eve. And it's because every year, it's the question is, was it 3 steps forward and 2 back, or, 4 back and 2 forward? I mean, there's so many different dynamics at play, and we've had some big wins. We've had some big missed opportunities over the last few years. I can kind of go through a couple of them. I was just thinking about our missed opportunities since 2016. One, back then we did have the opportunity to build the EA reservoir the way it was originally envisioned in the 2000 SERP plan, which was a 60,000 acre shallow water reservoir that would have been about 6 feet deep and would have more or less reproduced the natural Everglades. we didn't achieve that particular reservoir design. We ended up with a much smaller reservoir. With probably needs more STA. Well, definitely does. Another missed opportunity is back then we had the U.S. Sugar land option, which was sort of an archive of the Charlie Crist U.S. sugar deal, where he negotiated a deal in 2008 to purchase for the state of Florida to purchase U.S. sugar along with 165,000 acres of land and their entire operations. When that deal fell through in the 2008 recession, the purchase was broken down into a series of options, each one which got incrementally kind of more diluted for the state. But in 2015, 16, 17, a couple of those options passed that Governor Scott and the legislature decided not to execute. So those are missed opportunities. Also, as part of the SP10 negotiation, we handed back the last U.S. sugar option. We rescinded it, basically. The other thing we did is as part of SP10, we took eminent domain off the table. So basically, the state is not allowed to use eminent domain to acquire any land needed in the EAA for water and Everglades restoration. Those are missed opportunities. On the flip side, we've seen a lot of progress, despite its issues, which we hope to fix some of those issues. We do have an EAA reservoir, which we did not have back then. At least we have one that's on track. Everglades funding is at a historic high. And then most importantly, public understanding and engagement is off the charts for these issues for reasons that we kind of talked about earlier. And that's resulting in some political accountability. It's funny. I was at an EVCO, and I think it was 17 or 18, and Carl Hyacin, he said something really funny and interesting. He said every politician in the state of Florida at some point in their election cycle gets up behind they put on some khakis, they get behind a podium, and they talk about how much they love the Everglades. Every single one of them, and he's dead on about that. What they do after they win is another story. And I think today, a few years later, that probably extends to all our water quality issues in Florida, and that's because the public really cares about these issues right now, wants to fix them, and that's huge. I mean, this has become an election issue. So the elected officials don't always do what we want them to do, but they're no longer operating in darkness. And hopefully we can just continue down this path and continue to hold them accountable. And I think that'll result in continued change for the better over time, and more wins and hopefully less losses.
Thanks, Dave. Good summary. So we will take some audience questions now. And while we're waiting for our first question, I will just let everyone know that it is not too late to send Governor DeSantis a veto request message. You can check the chat for a link to do that, or go to everglades.org. I'm sure Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation has a link on its website too. Send one from either group, depending on where you live, and we will hope for a good outcome. We'd like to hit 3,000 veto request messages sent by next week. We're at about 2,500 now. All right, so we'll take our first question from Jeannie Emmerich. Hi, Jeannie. What can a citizen do in Southwest Florida and Martin County, East Coast areas? So what can a citizen do? Matt, I'll toss it to you first.
Yeah, I think there's lots of little actions that private citizen can take, whether that's not using fertilizers on your lawn, taking care of what's being washed down your storm sewers. And at this point, really engaging with your local politicians, though, is a huge one. I think, as you mentioned, sending a veto request right now, staying abreast of these issues, and really having a deeper understanding of what's going on so that we don't have that short-term memory loss that seems to be plaguing people. And just because the beaches are great now and the water is great now, we can't forget what's happened in years past and what's coming down towards us in the future if nothing changes. So definitely water conservation, nutrient reduction, and staying politically active.
My lawn is looking pretty brown right now, so I'll say I'm doing my part. And you mentioned the veto request letter, and so did I. if you have time, I think a phone call to the governor's office or any elected official's office goes a long way, right? Just articulate why you're concerned. If you only have a few minutes, a form letter with a quick message is fine. But if you can also make that phone call, please do. Gil, would you add anything to that?
I mean, no, but I think it's absolutely true that they pay attention. It's absolutely true that if they're getting bombarded with emails or phone calls, it signifies the fact that their constituents care about this issue and they need to do something about that. If they don't, it's when they don't hear from people that, it's just, they don't have to worry about that. They don't have to worry about what the public thinks if the public isn't weighing in. So it's important. And when we talk about this issue, I mean, there are practical things we can do, like the individual can do to reduce the nutrients that they're contributing to the system. We just talked about, fertilizer, that sort of thing. But as Dave said a little bit ago, at its root, this is a political problem. We need better legislation, and we need to stop the bad legislation. And the way to do that is to contact your legislators, is to let them know that you're watching, you're listening, you know what's going on, you understand what's going on. And that hopefully is where events such as this come into, help people sort of grasp the nuances of this. Because as Dave said, it is wonky, it's complex. And a lot of times the complexity, is what sort of dissuades people from wading into these issues where we need them to be. But hopefully, when we do things like this and other organizations do similar things, it helps bring up that level of understanding that people can speak, with some confidence that they do know what's going on. That was one of those big things at that hearing up in Tallahassee, the legislators saying, well, you don't know what's going on. You don't understand this. When you do understand it and you can articulate a position opposing it, I think the legislators sort of have to respect that. And I think that's what's going to ultimately move the needle, on when it comes to the politics surrounding these issues.
Yeah, a huge part of our work at Friends of the Everglades, going back to our founder, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, is translating really dense, complex water policy into terms that people can understand. I mean, it started with her book, River of Grass, the Everglades River of Grass, which celebrates its 75th anniversary this year. So that changed how people regarded the Everglades, right? It wasn't a swamp to be conquered. It was a treasure to be preserved. And today, wading into this legislation is not fun, but we take it very seriously. We think it's so important to help people have a clear-eyed view of what's going on so they can let their elected officials know if they approve or not. All right, we can take another question now. Allie Hartman is our communications director behind the scenes, manning the controls. Ed Killer, hi Ed. Ed Killer asks, how much water has gone to the Everglades this dry season? Leave it to Ed to ask a tough question. We know, Ed. Matt, do you know that number off the top of your head?
I do not know that number off the top of my head. I have an amazing team of people that I work with who I'm sure could tell you if they were here, but I defer to them on a lot of things that are the specific side of the hydrology. Definitely is outside of my purview. But.
Yeah, at every South Florida Water Management District governing board meeting, there's a presentation on how much water has moved south, how much water has gone into the 60,000 acres or so of stormwater treatment areas, how much of that is from the lake versus how much is from sugarcane fields. So it does include that figure. I do know that it's been a better than average year in terms of moving water south, but I don't have the exact numbers. So Ed,
I don't think there haven't been cutbacks at all to the Everglades deliveries this year, have there?
Right, correct.
Yeah.
So, thanks for the question, Ed. We'll try to do better next time. Let's see, one more question here. Jeannie again asks, does it make a difference if citizens/businesses manage better the fertilizer if they're near water? So, I mean, I'll say in a nutshell, yes. This came up in 2013 in Stewart. In fact, Sewell's Point was among the first municipalities in the state of Florida to pass a fertilizer ban. That's great. I think every city in Florida should do it. However, we should not think that that is going to solve all of our problems, right? 80% or so historically of the phosphorus input into Lake Okeechobee is from agriculture. So if we don't fix the biggest problem, the small measures won't help. We should do both. Anyone want to add anything to that, Dave, Matt?
Yeah, I think that that's a great point, and it definitely as you mentioned, every little bit helps. I think this is something that gets tossed into a lot of these discussions. The personal accountability and personal responsibility gets heralded as the way to solve the problem, and that ends up usually being a way for the parties that are causing the lion's share of the pollution to not be stuck with having to solve anything. So I think individual actions are important, but also understanding that there are huge forces at play here, and we all need to work together to try to combat some of them.
Thanks. Okay, so those are the end of our questions, I believe. So I think we're just going to spend a few minutes here kind of wrapping up. I'm going to give each of you some time to offer your takeaways. And I just want to remind the audience where we are right now. Sometime within the next 2 months, before June 30th, Governor DeSantis will receive Senate Bill 2508 on his desk. He can either sign it, veto it, or let it become law without his signature. 2,500 or so Friends of the Everglades supporters have sent veto requests, more from Sanibel Captiva. Other groups have joined the request for veto to Governor DeSantis. We are extremely hopeful that Governor DeSantis will consider vetoing this. We think it's incredibly important. In fact, I'll go as far as to say I think this might be the biggest test of his administration, because he signed a bad bill last year, Senate Bill 88, that supported the sugar industry and protected them from lawsuits related to sugarcane burning. He's come out in support of Wilton Simpson for agriculture commissioner in recent days, who backed this bill. So this is a really important test for the governor. So we hope that everyone listening will join the chorus and help him realize that, so that we can stop this bad legislation from becoming law. So with that said, I'm going to go around the horn here, and you can share your words of wisdom. I will start with you, Matt. Any final words on this topic?
I will give a quick response to Ed, as I mentioned that I have a great team of people that I work with, and one of them was nice enough to chime into the comments here that the Everglades has gotten almost 1.3 million acre feet of water so far. But all in all, I think that there is a lot of work left to be done. I think that it's great to see how many people are energized to do the work and are ready to support these causes. I think there's a huge understanding among Floridians and the average person that water is life, and our water quality is absolutely integral to the way of life that we have down here, and the health of the environment, and the estuaries and the bays and the rivers and the ocean itself are really tied to all the people. And people have started to completely wake up to that notion, and it's really encouraging, all the conversations I have with people, to see how excited and energized they are to do something positive to protect our waters and to really make a difference going forward.
Great. Thank you, Matt. Dave, on to you.
Something Matt mentioned earlier was in regards to fertilizer use and things like that, is every little bit helps. I think the same applies to advocacy. Every little bit helps. Anything that anybody out there, any of us can do, put aside 10 seconds of your day to press a button to send a form email, or pick up the phone and actually try to have a conversation with your legislator. Or if you feel compelled, drop everything and drive to Tallahassee at 3 a.m. to show up. That's important once in a while, right? And look, I'm not going to go to every hearing in Tallahassee, but once in a while, sometimes you got to go to the mats, and it's important to pay enough attention that when those times are, right? But yeah, every little bit helps, and just keep that in mind. And this is it can be a bit of a grueling battle, right? Because it's just like we talked about earlier with the game of whack-a-mole. It's just one thing after the next. They throw at us, and we're trying to get something good through. There's one hurdle after the next. So it's a hell of a fight that we're in. But if you can just try to do something, whether it's every day, every week, every month, once in a while, it's going to help if enough of us are of that mindset.
Thanks, Dave. Gil, final words from you.
I thought I'd become a cynic after 30 years in journalism, but this was an education. This was one of the most dishonest things I've ever seen. The way this bill was attempted to be rammed through, dishonest. And I think people need to understand that, it's important for people to become involved in the process so that we can get better legislation. We can sound off when we get bad legislation. But I think what we have to understand is, unfortunately, the legislature seems, it's going to go to bat for the status quo. It's going to go to bat for Big Sugar. It's going to go to bat for the people who are enjoying the privileges they have right now, which have resulted in the problems in our water. The deck is kind of stacked in that respect, but the way you unstack it is what Matt said and what Dave said and what you said. You learn about the issues and you get involved. That's the thing they want the least. So that's what we have to do the most.
Thanks, Gil. I'll end by saying this is an environmental issue. This is an economic issue, as Matt explained, and it's also an issue of public health. We know more than ever about the health risks involved in exposure to toxic algae. So for all of those reasons, it's really important for us to stay involved. Thank you to everyone who joined us. We're able to bring you these conversations free every month due to the support of our donors. We're deeply appreciative, and also very much appreciate all three of you for joining. Thank you so much and have a wonderful afternoon.